In less than 7 minutes, I'm going to show you 3 things you can take your shots from this to this. Now we all have the shot that you're like, oh my god, I love this, but I feel like it could be so much better. I just don't know how. So hopefully with these 3 tips, I'll take your composition to, hey, wow. But first you need to do 2 things for me. First, I need you to figure out the color palette of your image and where your major leading lines and focal points are. Once you've figured those out, we're going to now chip away with those 3 things that can be hurting your image. Now these tips can apply to both photography and painting, and I will be demonstrating these in Krita, so if you only do one but not the other, I promise you it will pay to stick around. Now let's troubleshoot what seems to be a perfectly fine photograph. After all, the subject's in focus and within the frames, so where do we go from here? When your background texture is competing or distracting from your subject. So many subjects need context in order to tell a complete story of what's going on, but the background is not the only thing that matters in your piece and can often detract from what you're actually trying to focus on. Furthermore, there is not much in this shot to pull the subject forward off the background noise to make that rider stand out. Number 2, color palette conflicts. Once you've established your main color palette, determine if there are objects in your piece that draw your attention away from where you want it. In this case, the magenta jacket is the only real red in this largely analogous color palette. Number 3, the importance of lines and space in your composition. The rail in the background here creates a distracting leading line left to right that draws your eye away from the rider and off the page. While it gives the viewer a nice crosshair to frame the subject, they are too heavy, and while I don't want them to go away, I do want them to not be so loud. How do we deal with these things? Tip number 1, blur your background. Blurring the background, whether it's in camera or in post, it does 2 things. It makes your subject stand out from the background where it may normally blend in, and it creates new accent lines that draw your eye away from the now low contrast background to the high contrast foreground, or in this case, your subject. As I've discussed in previous episodes, your brain and eye will be drawn to the higher contrast rather than the low contrast. In camera, this can be accomplished by adjusting your f-stop, while in post with a Gaussian blur, and in traditional media by blending or using a wet-on-wet technique. The farther away the background is, the more blur you would apply, but we'll get back to that in a minute. Tip number 2, lower the saturation of conflicting and competing colors. If you've done your homework by now, you understand the principles of color theory. This applies to all color, whether it's 2D or 3D. Rather than trying to remove and rebuild this composition, take the focus off the distraction by lowering its saturation. Because we may find this after the shot is taken and largely relies on filters in camera, I don't recommend you try this in camera rather than in post-production. In this picture, we are not only going to neutralize the red jacket, but also the distracting overbearing white fence. Both add context and value to the story of this composition, but frankly, a choir has to be of balanced volume, and this choir of boys is just way too loud. Digitally, in most programs, there is a brush setting to desaturate color, and you can adjust the strength of that effect as you use it. In traditional media, a complementary color will grade down or dull down the purity of a color. In addition to adjusting the hue of the color, changing the shade to a darker value may also be necessary in order to get objects to more smoothly fit into the composition. Tip number 3, understanding the importance of hard lines and soft transitions cannot be overstated. This original reference was taken on burst mode with the aperture set at f5. Because this is an action shot done on burst mode, most cameras will have an automated f-stop adjustment, which is what happened here. The whole scene is relatively crisp and in focus. However, this creates attention conflicts in the shot later as we look at it. We lose track of the rider's hair, her clothes seem to blend in with the background, and the rail and other riders in the background make it hard to appreciate the concentration of our rider, or even her horse. Because everything is in focus, we don't know where to rest our eyes, and even if we try, we get distracted by the rest of the shot. By creating a hard line, cutting off the rider from the background. By blurring the background, we eliminate the trees, dialing down the blur as the riders and the fence would be closer to us. No, they are not blurred the same, and pushing those distractions away as well. So where do you stop? I would say there's roughly 25 feet between the rider and the rail in the background. So this is where we're going to start taking away that blur effect altogether and start to transition into the foreground. This is the way you naturally see. Therefore, when you are looking at an image like this, your mind is not trying to process all the extra information it normally does not get, forcing you to be distracted when you're trying to just look at one thing. In this tip, the focus is the same. Bring down the non-subject contrast while retaining the subject's contrast, or using contrast to outline your subject and make it stand out from the background, thereby invoking positive and negative space. The farther away from your focal point, the softer your lines get. After applying these 3 tips, let's look at the before and after side by side, and let me know in the comments if you like the new result with our 3 tips applied, or if you think there's something else we should use to illustrate improving this composition.